Welcome to Adventures in Accessibility, a podcast that explores the far reaches of disability, access, and inclusion, with your host, Dana Barton.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Adventures in Accessibility. Today, we're speaking with Haley Moss. She's a South Florida native who was diagnosed with autism at age 3. Upon receiving her autism diagnosis, her family was told that she would be fortunate to make a friend, graduate high school, or even obtain her driver's license. Haley has defied the expectations set forth within her initial diagnosis. Today, she's an attorney, author, artist, and autism advocate who writes and speaks publicly about her journey and gives hope for other autistic people and their friends and families. All right. Haley, thank you for joining us today on Adventures in Accessibility. We're really happy to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Why don't we start by having you kind of give us a background of who you are and your career, because I think it's really neat.
Okay. So I'm Haley. I am autistic. I am a self-advocate, an artist, and an author. So the best way to describe me, I think, falls into all of those different things. I'm in my mid-20s at this point, which is kind of scary to think about. I have been an attorney for a little over a year at this point. I went to law school at the University of Miami. I went to college at the University of Florida, where I majored in psychology and criminology. I am the author of Middle School, The Stuff Nobody Tells You About, which is a guide for students on the autism spectrum to survive those very awkward adolescent years, because we all know they were very strange and uncomfortable for most of us, and it's even more awkward when you're autistic.
Sure.
And I also am the author of a freshman survival guide for college students with autism spectrum disorders, The Stuff Nobody Tells You About, which I worked on during my freshman year of college, because when I was in college, I wished that I had access to autistic people and things like that to understand what was going on, because most of the market was just stuff written by parents and other professionals, and I felt like there wasn't anything written by us for us. So I wanted to help close that gap and at least be able to be that person for somebody else.
Absolutely. So tell us about you were diagnosed with autism when you were 3 years old. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. And did you grow up kind of with this label of being a child with autism?
I didn't ever see it as a bad thing. You have to kind of understand, my parents are really cool people. Mm-hmm. And I never felt like I was weird or different. I always believed, even when I wasn't invited to like birthday parties and things like that, I genuinely believed that I was really cool and everybody else was wrong or was weird or didn't understand something. I didn't think it was ever, oh, I'm different or anything like that. I always grew up having really high self-esteem and I was very confident. My parents told me I was autistic when I was 9 years old. I was obsessed with Harry Potter.
Okay.
And over the summer, my mom is like, you have magical powers, and being 9 years old, I totally buy it. And she explains to me that being different is neither better nor worse. It's just different.
Sure. And
different could be extraordinary. So we ended up highlighting and focusing on the strengths rather than all the different weaknesses and things that I struggled with. So instead of focusing on the fact that I struggled making friends or I wasn't friends with all the girls in my class, we would talk about that I'm really sensitive, that I have a lot of creativity, that I have a good memory, that I care about people and I'm kind, like all these different things that stuck with me far more than, oh, you kind of aren't the best at making friends and you miss a lot of social cues and you take language literally. And instead of focusing on things that might be seen as deficits or that are difficult for me, we tried to focus on the strengths and build that confidence. And it honestly helped a lot. So I never thought of myself as like different or the kid with autism that you described. I just thought of myself as me, and these are the things that made me who I am.
Yeah. Did you find it challenging? You know, you've written a book about middle school and kind of those awkward years. Did you find it challenging to be in school and it kind of explaining yourself maybe to other students or teachers? What was that like for you?
So I went to 3 schools in 3 years, which is why middle school especially was an awkward time for me, and why I felt like I was kind of an expert when I was writing about it, is because I had 3 very different experiences in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So I had to have those different conversations throughout. So when I was younger, I wasn't necessarily open about my autism with every person I ever met. I wasn't out and proud the way that I am now. I kind of had it reserved as a conversation reserved for teachers, close friends, more of a need to know basis. And with teachers and stuff, we would have meetings at the beginning of every school year, like my parents and I, and the teachers, and we'd talk about what that meant, what my goals were, and things like that. So kind of, I was in private school, so it's kind of like an IEP meeting. I guess you could say it was more 504.
Okay.
But what we would do is we'd talk about what we wanted to achieve, what I wanted to do that year. And I was at the age, at least at that point, that I was able to sit in on these meetings and have input. So most of the things I would say is I just really wanted help making friends. Because I didn't struggle academically. I didn't really struggle with my classes. I always was a very good student. I was mostly an A student up until probably law school. But because law school grading is a whole other ball game. So I didn't struggle in school. So I struggled a lot with making friends, keeping friends. And that's the stuff that I wanted help with when I was in school during the day. And at home, I definitely struggled more with the independent living stuff, the executive function. So my mom would help me a lot with keeping a calendar or organizing and outlining the reading because I just couldn't sometimes figure out how to do that stuff. So we had all sorts of different systems. And I think there was a lot more work behind the scenes than you saw at school.
Sure. What made you decide to go to law school and kind of pursue your law degree?
So I would say I'm not the person you thought was going to go to law school. So you know how when you see little kids, who joins a debate team, who is very outspoken, who argues over everything and analyzes everything. That was definitely not me. So in school, I was very quiet. I was originally in drama up until about the 6th grade. I loved acting. I also was in the newspaper. I was very involved with the fine arts. So I was always doing drawing and painting stuff. So I wasn't really the person you would have pinpointed as going to law school early on, which I always like to point out because I like to make it clear that the profession is very accessible to all people and all backgrounds like that. So I went to college originally thinking I was going to be a doctor. And needless to say, I took my first semester of chemistry. About 6 weeks in, I realized I don't like the sciences. This is hard. I'm not passionate about it. This isn't working. And like everybody else in the class, well, not everybody, because there are plenty of people I went to college with that are now entering their residencies, that I dropped chemistry. And I was like, well, now that I'm not going to be a doctor, what am I going to do? And I had to think about, what do I actually enjoy? So I always like to write. I was working on the college book at the time. I was already published with middle school, and I was writing a column every month for a parenting website. I already knew that I loved to write. And I also love to talk to people. Like I mentioned, I used to do acting, so I loved getting to be on stage. It didn't make me nervous. I loved public speaking. I've done a couple like conferences and things like that at that point too. And I'm like, you know what? Lawyers do a lot of writing and a lot of talking. And I knew whatever I had to do also had to be able to benefit other people and make a difference. So at first I was hesitant, and then I realized that's what lawyers actually have the potential to do every day and should be doing. And it shouldn't be the scary villains that we see on TV, because lawyers aren't the bad guys all the time. And I always feel like that's kind of one of the stereotypes that I want to dismantle as well about lawyers, not necessarily disability, but that's something about lawyers in general, is people always think of us as the bad guys, but really we're the ones who are able to make a difference every single day. And knowing that that's possible made me want to go to law school.
Yeah. Did you have to have any accommodations throughout college or law school as a result of having autism?
So in college, the big thing that I wanted was housing, because I'm like, I'm so scared to do the random roommate. I don't know. I've never lived on my own. I never even went to like sleepaway camp. Okay. Like I had no experience being on my own whatsoever.
Sure.
And I like to preface with that. And of course, at that age, especially at 17, 18 years old, you think that you are either you have really good masking skills and can pass as neurotypical, or you also think that you want the most typical experience that you can have. So I wanted that. I wanted a roommate, which when I spoke to housing at first, I'm like, hi, I'm autistic. They were like, do you want a single room? And I was like, I want a roommate, but you have to help me find the right person.
Sure.
Instead of just get a random roommate. And I got to interview a bunch of sophomores who were looking for roommates because I thought it would be better to have an older person that can maybe show me the ropes and maybe have like a big sister type on campus. And that would make me feel more comfortable. So I wanted this typical roommate experience. And in hindsight, I wish that I didn't.
Interesting.
The roommate that I ended up choosing, it didn't end up working out. She and I did not get along once we lived together. We had a lot of fundamental disagreements. I had a lot of horror stories, as most people like to tell you about their freshman roommates. She and I don't talk anymore, if that makes it any better. I don't think I've spoken to her since I moved out.
Wow. Okay.
And I ended up moving out after the first semester, and then housing helped accommodate me with a single room, which is what they offered me to begin with. And I was going through the process again to get a single on campus because I realized I needed my own space. I needed to live alone. I've lived alone since that spring semester of freshman year of college. It helped me a lot. And I know I probably wouldn't have gotten that if I didn't meet with disability services, who introduced me to the folks at housing as well.
Okay.
In law school, everyone lived off campus. I tried to get on campus accommodations, but the thing with accommodations generally, it depends on the school. I know sometimes they want a new assessment or new psychoed evals and all that stuff. And it's like, okay, do I want to live with a bunch of undergraduates if I get given this accommodation? So I realized, at least as I got older, it became a lot of self-accommodation because I didn't need stuff like extra time on tests. Right. I needed help with like independent living skills type things. So we ended up finding an apartment that was really close to campus that was walkable because I don't enjoy driving. I have a driver's license, but it gives me extreme anxiety. And I also can't figure out the spatial relationships of parking very well.
Okay.
So I wanted to be close enough to campus that it was accessible without driving. So that was a challenge, but I found that. And managing my schedule and stuff, I realized you do a lot of self-accommodating of trying to make things work. And even in my last law firm job, I realized you do a lot of self-accommodation. Yeah. Because there are things that you realize you need, but you might be able to adjust on the fly or be able to adjust yourself to make the environment more accessible to you that maybe another person can't control. Sure.
So you mentioned housing in your freshman roommate. Mm-hmm. Do you talk about that in the freshman survival guide for college students? I do, because I think housing is something that's really important for all young adults on the spectrum, especially with the dorm experience. I think a lot of us do. If we do go to live away, you want to be as typical, quote unquote, as possible because you want that experience. You don't want to feel like you're missing out. And I think that's what happened to me is I didn't want to feel like I was missing out. So I wanted the roommate. Sure. What else do you bring up or discuss in your book?
I try to discuss anything and everything. So I want to talk about making friends, socializing, living in the dorms, getting academic support, safety. And of course, now that I've went to higher education for 6 years, which would have been 7, I just graduated early from college. And when I think about it more, I'm like, there's so much more stuff I wish I could have talked about because when you're a freshman and you're writing, and then when you're on the other side completely, you're like, there's so many things that I wish I had known better. Yeah. And I think one of those things was as well as making certain relationships like professors and how to do that. Because I remember my sophomore year of college, I worked in a research lab and I TA'd a class, and that was monumental for me. But I wasn't thinking about that stuff when I was brand new to school.
Sure. So talk to us about, how do you make relationships with professors or teachers? What advice would you have for others?
I think it's really difficult. So, because I know even in law school, I didn't have as many of those relationships as I wanted, but I think it's important to find someone who either their interests align with yours, because then you can talk about that. And also just don't be afraid to ask for help, which I know sounds very cliche to people, but I wish that I had known if I didn't understand something, I can ask in office hours and not feel like a failure for it. Because I think when you're a young person with a disability, I feel like there's this belief that independence means that you must do everything by yourself, is that you believe, or you're afraid that if you can't do something or you're struggling with something, your independence is going to get revoked. I think there's this fear that a lot of us have, and you don't want to get help in certain aspects of your life. And it took me a while to kind of realize, independence means knowing when to ask for help, knowing when you need that extra support, knowing that you can be interdependent, and it doesn't mean you can't do things on your own either. So I think that's a concept that is something that I know I struggled with, because I never liked asking for help from teachers because I thought it meant that I was doing something wrong or I didn't understand, and I didn't want to be seen as incompetent.
Sure.
But I realized that asking for help or clarification on something means that I will ultimately be better at it. Even at work, sometimes I'd be like, hey, can you just explain this to me in a different way? And it's not that I might not understand it. I might not understand the way that something's being presented.
Sure.
So even just asking for clarification or saying, did I understand this right, can be a great way to get to that point of understanding and comprehension. So I think it really is a very multifaceted thing in building relationships, asking for help, and also realizing it doesn't mean that you're failing or you're not going to be able to have any independence, and that it's totally okay and it's totally acceptable and in fact normal to not be able to do everything on your own.
Yeah. Well, what about relationships, making relationships or friendships as you entered into college and beyond? What's that been like for you? You've said that that's kind of been a struggle.
I still struggle making friends. I still struggle keeping friends. And I think that is also just because there's so much that goes into it. So I would always try to meet people through common interests. So like clubs or general interest groups, things like that too. So I met a lot of people when I was in college living in the dorms. I lived in the honors dorm. So I met all the kids that were in the honors program. Mm-hmm. So I had that in common with them, as they were usually people that did very well at their high schools. I went to a public college. So most of the people who were in honors were people that went to very good high schools or did really well performing at their high school. So I had that in common, that like, okay, these are kids that are serious about their stuff, that aren't just going to be off the rails partying every single day, because that definitely wasn't me.
Sure.
So that was already kind of a start. I tried to join things that I cared about. So I signed up for student government at one point. I joined the autism group on campus because I'm like, okay, I knew I liked autistic advocacy, but I didn't know what our campus was offering, and I wanted to get involved with the students there. Usually it was a lot of students who were studying to be occupational therapists, SLPs, things of that nature. Mm-hmm. So it was definitely an experience being probably the only neurodivergent person in the room talking about autism. Yeah. So I was able to make a lot of friends, I think. Not really, and I don't really know if I'd say they were friends, but I was at least able to make a lot of acquaintances because I would be able to lend that perspective to the room, and I was accepted and respected for it. So that was always something I appreciated. And that's kind of when I realized you can't be the only person in the room talking about this stuff. When it comes to talking about people with disabilities or autism, you can't be the only person who has that experience in the room. And that's something that I take very seriously now, is when it comes to nonprofit boards or anything like that. I'm like, if you are serving autistic people or people with disabilities, do you have other autistic people or people with disabilities on your board and your staff roles, volunteers, et cetera, et cetera. So it's something that college also taught me to think a little bit more about too. I also went on a diversity retreat my second semester that I absolutely loved. And you took all these people from different backgrounds and who were marginalized in some way out camping for like 3 days. And for me, that was a disaster. The whole camping thing, I don't think was very accessible in its own way. So it was like these like log cabins. It was very like roughing it, I guess is the best way to put it. But it's very emotional. It's very vulnerable, and you connected with people you might not have otherwise connected with. And it's the first time a lot of my peers learned anything about disability. And it was the first time I know I learned a lot about social justice. So sure. That 3-day retreat was probably my intro to social justice education.
Okay. And from there, you've kind of, you speak about neurodiversity. You talk about what that looks like in the workforce. Maybe for some of our listeners who aren't as familiar with neurodiversity, could you kind of explain that for us?
Absolutely. So neurodiversity is the idea that like we have different brains, kind of like how we have biodiversity in different species. We all have different brains, and people who are neurodivergent or neurodiverse, whatever word you choose, I believe neurodivergent is the correct grammar in this case, but I sometimes will use them interchangeably because it's just a habit. So people that are neurodivergent, neurodiverse usually are people who might have labels such as autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, other developmental disabilities, certain psychiatric conditions, etc. And the idea is that this is naturally occurring. This is to be accepted and respected, and it's just part of humanity. So it is kind of also a frontier under civil rights as well, that we are still underneath people with disabilities and deserve to have equal rights and to have respect in the workplace. As you know, many people with disabilities and neurodivergent folks especially are unemployed or underemployed. So there's so many different things that come into this under a rights perspective that it's really important to keep that in mind too. So pushing for neurodiversity, at least for me, is that it won't be a big deal when autistic people or people who are different actually achieve things or get things done or are part of our everyday lives, and not just people that we see as less.
Did you learn about being neurodivergent or neurodiversity in undergrad? Did you look at it more when you went into law school? How did you kind of get yourself up to speed and educated around neurodivergent individuals?
I feel like the first time I heard the word neurodiversity was probably late in high school or early in college. I don't remember when, but I remember writing about it for the student newspaper. Like, hey, neurodiversity is diversity too. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people that I knew definitely didn't ever think about it. And it was something that I realized was really important. And then the more I learned about the history of it and that it's been around since the 90s, I was like, oh my God, this is so fascinating, so important, and I want to be a part of it. So I learned as much as I could, and I realized I wanted to just incorporate this message of inclusion wherever I go and with whatever I do. And of course now, and since I've first learned about it, neurodiversity has exploded. So we hear a lot more about it online. We see a lot more about it in like workforce recruitment. It's something that we hear a lot about, but I feel like it's important to understand who's talking about it and how we can all do better as a team.
Yeah. So you are the first openly autistic person, attorney, I guess, in the state of Florida. Is that right?
That is what I've heard as far as documentation. I think that being openly autistic, I don't think I'm the first autistic attorney ever, and definitely not in Florida, but I think being open is a distinguishing factor because so many people, as you know, might not disclose a disability or an autism diagnosis because of fear of stereotyping, discrimination. So I realize I have a lot of privilege in being open. And I also realize it's very bold to disclose so quickly and be exactly who I am and have the freedom to do so as I navigate the workplace and life in general.
Okay. So once you graduated from law school and you were looking for permanent employment, were you open about your disability through the interview process? And what did that look like for you?
So I was extremely lucky that I had a job offer waiting for me upon graduation.
Okay.
So I was a summer associate during my second year of law school, and the firm that I summered at offered me a full-time offer pursuant to passing the bar, which is pretty normal for most offers that you get. If you do summer and they give you an offer, you have to obviously pass the bar after graduation, because otherwise, you kind of can't practice. That's kind of a thing.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
But I remember even when I was looking for summer associate positions that there wasn't very many that under diversity would include disability. And I wasn't sure how to go about that either, because I didn't feel like I belonged in the diversity pile because they weren't mentioning it. Mm-hmm. So law firms in general have a big disability issue, is that less than 1% of attorneys in general are people with disabilities. Mm-hmm. So it definitely is at the forefront of something that I like to talk about and I like to get lawyers thinking about at this point in my career. But I also realized when I was looking for jobs, how was I going to do this? And I actually ended up getting my summer associate position by chance. So I met someone in an elevator. We were having a discussion and they asked me to send a resume, brought me in for an interview, and I had a job waiting for me that summer all of a sudden.
That's great.
So I feel like for me, I didn't have to go through a lot of that stuff, but I don't know how it would have turned out. I'm sure, and I have faith that it would have turned out totally okay. Mm-hmm. I have faith I would have gotten that summer associate position. I have faith that I would have gotten a job after graduation, but I feel like the way that things shook out for me happened the way it did for a reason. And I'm very grateful that it did.
Yeah. Yeah. And so if I understand correctly, you are not currently with a law firm. You've kind of gone off into a more advocacy, public speaking.
Yeah. I left my law firm job right before New Year's and I started a business doing advocacy, public speaking, consulting on workplace issues, and also more writing and trying to work on another book right now. So it's definitely an exciting time.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get some of that. But I do eventually want to go back to litigating. I absolutely love the idea of educating people at this point as well, because I think education is such a powerful tool before litigation happens. But I also think litigation is really interesting and I think it's fun too. So yeah, I love getting to blend every aspect of my background together however I can.
Yeah. What type of law were you practicing?
My previous job was in healthcare litigation and international law. So I did a lot of anti-terrorism work. So I would represent victims of terrorism.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Dang, that's awesome. I mean, not awesome, but
it was pretty cool. Honestly, it sounds really cool, but at the end of the day, sometimes I thought it was kind of terrifying.
Oh, I imagine
like
it would be terrifying.
Based on who the defendants were and stuff like that, you'd be like, "This is freaky. Am I gonna get hurt or something?" And then you realize your name's not on any of the pleadings. It's all like your supervisors. But
so you're good. Oh, that's so interesting. Good. That's so interesting. Well, since we are a podcast really focusing on accessibility and the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we've spoken with some other attorneys on this podcast before, but my question is, when did you learn about the ADA, and was it discussed in law school at all for you?
The first time I heard of the ADA was probably when I was a little kid.
Yeah.
I remember my mom mentioning it to me at one point, being like, nobody messes with the ADA. Like joking, like even like if anything happened, I'm like, and I didn't quite understand what that meant, but at least in the classes that I took in law school, nobody really taught the Americans with Disabilities Act. I kind of did a lot of learning about the ADA because I did my law review article when I was in my second year on testing accommodations. So
sure.
I got to learn all about the ADA in terms of testing after you graduate from college. So if you're taking like the LSAT or like the bar exam or the GRE or anything that's after you're in school, and you can have like the college or K through 12 kind of vouch for you and help you with that process and stuff that isn't under IDEA or 504. So that's when I really started understanding the nitty gritty of the ADA and all the different titles and what really goes on, is because I focused a lot of my early research on what happens when like the testing companies would flag scores that were taken with extra time. And as you know, they settled that with the LSAT probably, I think it was 2012. I'm not 100% sure of the year. I can't remember off the top of my head right now. It's been a while since I've revisited this research.
Sure.
But I remember when that settled, or it was 2015. I don't remember. Now it's going to drive me crazy. I know it was somewhere in that range of when I was in school.
Okay.
And it was millions of dollars, and that LSAC had to stop flagging scores that were getting extra time or saying this test was not taken under usual circumstances, which usually meant this applicant requested extra time accommodation, and all admissions officers kind of knew exactly what it meant.
Yeah.
So it was kind of disclosing people's status when they didn't want to. So I got to learn all about that and read all different court decisions and understand the ADA in that context. And for me, the ADA is really important in understanding it more, especially because I don't know what life is like without it. The ADA turns 30 this year. I am not 30.
Right.
I am under the age of 30. So when I see the ADA, I look at it as I can't imagine the generation before me or the activists and advocates who came before me existing without this in place. And the ADA isn't perfect. I think there's a lot more that could be done to protect our civil rights and different things that obviously weren't accounted for when the ADA was passed in 1990.
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting seeing it from that perspective. And also, okay, I am the ADA generation that existed with this in place. How can we make it that the next generation has even more safeguards in place and can keep this work going?
Yeah. What would your recommendations be so that we can provide better accommodation, better accessibility for future generations?
I think universal design is really exciting stuff just to get that started. I want to see more of that. I also know in the courts, we've seen a lot about web accessibility.
That's a huge topic.
Yeah, like all the stuff that Haben Girma has done over the years.
Yes.
I think web accessibility is absolutely fascinating, and I'd love to see that codified at some point rather than just in court decisions. So I'd love to see more on web accessibility. I'd love to see more even best practices for people that just don't know, like finding different resources on web accessibility, for instance, can be difficult, and even just how to accommodate certain things. So even just, I feel like more explainers and more policy for the public to understand would be really important, because we can probably talk about what the statutes say all day long, but and how courts are interpreting them, it can go one of two ways, or there could be splits depending on where you live. And if the Supreme Court will or won't take it up, how it interacts with other pieces of legislation. I think that there needs to be more that's accessible in terms of ADA education. Yeah.
I think you're right. And hopefully we're doing that by just even recording this podcast and making sure that people throughout the world and in the United States are hearing the voices of individuals with disabilities and bringing accessibility to the forefront of their minds.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the dream.
I hear you. So tell us, if our listeners wanted to find you, are you on social media?
I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Haley Moss Art. So okay. I originally signed up for social media when all I was doing was artwork, and getting my name on social media is the impossible dream. So everything is at Haley Moss Art on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I have a website at haleymoss.net.
Awesome. Well, we will tag those in our show notes. We'll provide a transcript in our show notes as well. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us, or anything you'd like to leave our listeners with today, Haley?
I think we covered a lot of ground, but I still hope that everyone stays hopeful and safe, of course, during this time. And also I think the future of the ADA and accessibility is at a really interesting point right now, especially with a lot of people working remotely. I am very excited to see what the future looks like.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we're excited to have you in our future and out there advocating, writing books, and educating people. We're lucky to have individuals like you sharing your stories. So thank you, Haley.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Adventures in Accessibility. Tune in next time for another dive into the unknown.
Adventures in Accessibility is hosted by Dana Barton, produced by Emily Schumann, and Mike Shea is our sound engineer. This podcast is a project of the Rocky Mountain ADA Center and is funded under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. Grant number 90DP0094-01-00. This production is intended solely for entertainment and informal guidance and should not be considered legal advice. The opinions expressed by guests are not necessarily held or endorsed by the Rocky Mountain ADA Center.